Continuing chapter 3 of part 7. They were the special adherents of Herod Antipas, and perhaps personal attendants upon that tetrarch, who, we learn from Luke 23:7, happened to be present at this Passover. This dynasty was a compromise between the total national independence, of which this party of the Jews were in despair, and direct Roman rule, which was, to the minds of the Jews, the extreme of political degradation. And, well, shouldn't it be about the principles? The consciousness involved? Not which party's ruling? The Herodians did not represent a theological or ecclesiastical sect, but a political party. The Sadducees, although they were unorthodox materialists, desired to maintain the ancient faith against other forms of civilization, which were, for the most part, older. And the Pharisees, who were the orthodox religionists, preferred the domestic tyranny of the family of Herod the Great, who were nominally Orthodox Jews. Well, doesn't that make it worse? You know, that you're ruled by somebody who doesn't, just like Saudi Arabia or something, they're not ruled by Ibn Abdul Wahhab's teachings. They're not ruled by referring directly to the fundamentals themselves. They're more secular, and they support Israel over their own people, and various things that it makes the Muslimin look bad. So wouldn't it be the same thing? 2. The presence and role as some heathen appointee of the Roman emperor. It thus happened that sometimes the Pharisees and at other times the Sadducees are found in close fellowship with the Herodians, but the basis of the fellowship was political and not religious. It is to be observed that all these parties had the most intense bitterness of hatred towards Rome, and that makes their conduct on this occasion the more vile, because since Jesus cannot be forced to take the role of a political messiah, they determined, if possible, to involve him in the fate which would have come upon any man who attempted that perilous part and failed. Well, obviously he had a social role, but he wasn't, but then again, he would have needed the support of the people to do that, not just some random person. I want to rule the country. Well, just because, or perhaps the intention was to drive him into taking the headship of a rebellion against Rome. Well, Judah Barabbas ben Judah was that sort of figure, and he was killed with his 2 witnesses and wrote something that looks like the book of Revelations, a lot better written than the Greek rewrite by John Patmos. And thus realize their political hopes or crush him out of their way as the social rulers of the people. When priests and politicians combine, there is the culmination of human ability. With these malicious feelings, they sent a body of probably young men of both parties who should now go to him as private persons, as Orthodox Jews, as devoted to the theocracy, as scrupulous men who were to propound to Jesus an ensnaring question as if it were simply one which was troubling their consciousness. The historian says in Luke 20, who should feign themselves to be just men, if they might take hold of his conversation, and so they might deliver him to the power and authority of the governor. The manner of the approach was gracious, the style of the address was complimentary. They said, Teacher, we know that you are true, and that you teach the way of God and truth. Neither do you care for anyone. For you do not look to the face of men. Guileful as were his enemies, they were compelled to give this faithful description of the character and teaching of Jesus. He was truthful because he was independent. He had demonstrated in his ministry of 3 years that he could not be moved by any appeal men could make to his hopes or to his fears. He was independent because he was righteous. All this was truth to which the people could bear witness, but it was not uttered in the spirit of truth, and while essentially and profoundly true in itself, it was a lie on the lips of these tempters. The intent of this manner of address is quite obvious. It was an attempt to cozen Jesus. It was a movement to excite him into such a feeling of superiority that he should dare utter what would bear a treasonable interpretation which the Herodians would report, and to which the Pharisees, as impartial and unpolitical persons, would bear testimony. The question was one of marvelous adroitness. It seemed to demand a categorical answer, yes or no, or enforced silence. Well, to some extent, of course, you have to obey the political rules of what the system that you're in. But then there's the other side of the answer, too. It was this: tell us, then, what you think. Is it lawful to give tribute to Caesar or not? No Z, no... anyways. If he said, yes, it is lawful, he would shock the Jewish prejudices of the populace. Well, perhaps it's not lawful to charge the tax, but, he would be charged with inculcating a humiliating submission to a conqueror. Now, heathen, pagan, Gentile, all these things are not just, have nothing to do with what tribe you were born into. The atheist, I think, was one of the words that are rendered into such words in the Bible, but polytheists, yeah, probably. He would disparage his claims to the messiahship. It would be outrageous that the theocratic king of the Jews should teach submission to a heathen oppressor of his own people. Now, just like Muhammad, Jesus was somebody that, he wasn't going to force, the Messiah part of Jesus, not the Barabbas part of Jesus, but the Messiah part of Jesus was somebody that wasn't going to force people to accept him as their theological leader. And it took, people who didn't, and honestly, if there weren't enough people following him as their theological leader, there wasn't going to be a populace that said, oh yeah, he's the best leader for, like they did with Muhammad. Muhammad was chosen to be leader of Yathrib when Yathrib was a majority of people who didn't believe him as a prophet. More Jews there than Muslimin, but they accepted Muhammad as their political leader. Of course, Jesus here is trying to be both. It's the idea. An affirmative answer would thus destroy his present popularity and his prospects of future advancement, or so they thought. If he had said, no, it is not lawful, there would be ground on which to rest an accusation of rebellion. It might be a speech to pass without notice, if uttered by some bigoted rustic in a Jewish village. Now, see, calling people bigoted because they're not of your group, that's just not right either. But spoken by a very popular teacher at the high festival in the metropolis and in the temple of his nation, it becomes altogether another thing. Now, the people are submitting to the really secular ruler Herod, but we can't tolerate the same thing from a non-Jew. It's like, well, if it's not right for a non-Jew, why is it right for a Jew, right? Rome would not pass lightly by such a speech of such a man under such circumstances. These conspirators supposed that he must say yes or no, and perhaps it occurred to them that if for any reason Jesus should see fit to decline an answer, this would put him just where he had placed them by his dilemma in regard to John the Baptist, and that thus they should recover the ground they had lost in that conflict. Augustus Caesar. Okay. Ab Civis Servatas. Augustus Caesar. Okay. But Jesus neither kept silence nor gave a categorical reply. He read them through and through. He upbraided them for their dissimulation. That's interesting what they do with the laurel wreath there, because it's kind of like, in the middle there. See that? He upbraided them for their dissimulation. Why do you tempt me, you hypocrites? And then he turned upon them with a most unexpected movement. Show me the coin of the tribute, he said. And they brought him a denarius, the common silver coin of the empire, then in circulation in Palestine. They called it Palestine because they conquered it. So why in the world the people who could have named the country aren't the people who are the ones you pay taxes to? It just doesn't make sense, right? Being the ordinary pay for a day's labor. Well, a good day's labor, obviously. He held a piece of money in his hand and asked, not that he did not know, but manifestly that their own lips should speak it. Whose is the image and superscription? They answered, Caesar's. His reply was like a flash of inspiration. Render therefore Caesar's things unto Caesar, and God's things unto God. Because every C there is a letter K, right? Was there? It's the K pronunciation. Because the Greek, because the Latin-speaking people all the time, it's like, why in the world do we have a C and a K if they make the same sound? Of course, later languages would show some sort of difference with that, but was there ever anything fairer? The net was torn in pieces. All morality, all piety, and all the companionship of the numerous duties were put into 11 Greek words, which require only the same number of English words to translate them, which is often not the thing with translations, is the number of words and orders and stuff like this can end up changing. All personal devotion to God, all justice towards man, all equipoise of character were set forth in a sentence which can be pronounced in a breath. They had accepted money from Caesar's mint, thus acknowledging the dominion of the emperor. Thus, they had settled against themselves in practically everyday life the question which one of their schools had determined in the rabbinical rule: the coin of the country shows the master. Ellicott quotes Maimonides in, is that a Z or an S, or Gazelo, chapter 5, Ubi cunc misma regis et acujus obtenet elic in colla recum istem pro domino agnoscunt. See also Lightfoot's Horeb in Matthew 22:20. Jesus thus gave a summary of his teaching in an answer, the most profound because it states what underlies all life and all duties thereof, the most lofty because it crowns the highest hopes of man for this present life and is grandest for the life to come, the most beautiful because in it law and freedom kiss each other, the most powerful because it holds despotism and anarchy apart. It holds religion and progressive free life together, No other one sentence uttered among men has done so much for the progress of human society. It was not a divorcing of religion from government and a putting of God out of the affairs of the nations, as if human government and divine rule stood at neutrality or in antagonism. As I think I mentioned Muhammad earlier, and he did not believe in forcing, the Islamic idea of government is not to force religion on people. No punishment for apostasy, blasphemy, or disbelief to any degree. Certain physical crimes can be associated for some people like that, but that's, not something they force. People of adolescence onwards, they're not forced to get up and pray and all that other stuff. There's rules about, the people who do pray and stuff, not abusing people with their yelling and all that stuff. Religion is, nor was it a sanction of Jewish ideas of unity, as if service to an earthly monarch or treason to God, as under their theocracy they had grown to believe since God was king. Caesar exists by appointment of God. Well, God not stopping humans from making the bad decisions, because, dictators, if that's what you're going to call it, they're not not all the Roman and Greek rulers were dictators, but whatever system of government, it takes more than one person or a couple people in the office, in political positions to say what the government is. Government does not exist by the will of the governed, nor by the will of the governor, but by the ordinance of God. While God sets the natural laws, men dare not be without government, nor is it practicable if men should attempt it. Duty to the government is best discharged by devotion to God, and duty to God involves the discharge of obligations to the government. These hypocrites and liars who were tempting Jesus were, like all the disciples of the higher law school in every age, making their pretended piety an excuse for a violation of civil obligations. They were willing to serve neither God nor Caesar, pleading one against the other that they might be free from both. But Jesus, instead of admitting the alternative of Caesar or God, assumes and impresses the connection of Caesar and God. Perhaps the idea that Jesus intended to convey a lesson by the allusion to the image on the coin is not without foundation. It is obtained in all Christian ages. Man bears God's image in his soul from the birth and is a man because he does bear that image, as a piece of silver is a coin because it bears the image of the reigning prince. Render your inner spiritual life to God and devote your outer worldly life to your country. Might seem to be the lesson for each individual. In any case, there is no collision of duties. When the Pharisees and Herodians heard the saying of Jesus, they marveled at the wisdom of his reply, and seeing that they could not take hold of his words before the people, they held their peace and left him and went their way. But the pursuit of Jesus was not to be thus abandoned. If he cannot be caught by an adroit question regarding political principles, perhaps he can be betrayed into saying something which shall rouse against him the adherents of one of the sects among the people. To that end, the Sadducees approached him, and they had a question so shaped that any answer they could conceive would either commit him against the law of Moses or drive him into the helplessness of his silence. Jesus had endorsed the law of Moses and had also explicitly taught the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead. The Sadducees were materialistic pantheists. They did not believe in any spirit, whether of man, angel, or God. They did not believe in the resurrection of the body, and therefore, as the body was all there was of man, the continued existence of conscious personal identity was not received by them. They ran their principles to the logical ends of atheism or pantheism. Well, if they believed in nothing spiritual, there was no such thing as pantheism to such a people. But in outward life, they were decent and considered themselves part of the ecclesiastical community. And so far as we can see, we're not debarred by their philosophical tenets from being members of the Sanhedrin, which indicated that they weren't atheists. Still, they're overstepping it, but they were, secular people, I guess. Judaism isn't a thing for life outside of temple or something, right? There are people like that. For political reasons, they were ready to join the Pharisees and the Herodians. Indeed, some of the sect may have been Herodians, in putting aside a man whose course threatened to bring the Jews into collision with the Romans without the prospect of making a successful revolt against the dominant empire. The Sadducees plant themselves on Moses and quote the law of the Levirate marriage thus. Teacher Moses said, "If anyone die having no children, his brother shall marry his wife and raise up seed to his brother. But there were with us 7 brothers, and the first, having married, died, and not having seed, he left his wife to his brother. Likewise, the second also, and the third, until the 7th, and last of all, the woman died. Now in the resurrection of which the 7 shall she be wife." From their standing point, it seems like a difficulty from which Jesus cannot extricate himself. He must admit that their statement of law being a free rendering of Deuteronomy 25:5 is quite correct. Then they state a case, whether it occurred in real life or is imagined in order to test the principle is not important. It might occur. It would have been sufficient to take the very case which Moses supposed, namely of 2 brothers, but the greater the number, the greater the perplexity. And therefore they state 7. It is clear that they suppose that Moses did not believe in the resurrection, and the question which they state involves, as they think in any reply which Jesus can make, a surrender of the truth of the doctrine of the resurrection, or of the binding force of the law of Moses. It is quite clear that they did not propound the question that they might be enlightened. It was to entangle Jesus. But the reply of Jesus was lofty in its spirit and demolishing in its stroke. He did not deign a reply to a sneer at a great doctrine, nor a solution specially applicable to a case sensually conceived and coarsely stated. He showed their folly and stated the great principle involved in the case, and demonstrated by a single quotation from the writings of Moses that the great lawgiver was neither pantheist nor Sadducee. His reply was, "You are wandering, knowing neither the scriptures nor the power of God, for in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but as the angels of God in heaven are they." Doesn't mean you can't have family life in paradise. But it's not per se the business transaction that it is here or whatever. It's more something that comes naturally. You get up there and say, "Oh, well, here are your wives," and all that. But the heavenly angels are genderless, so you got to get beyond the things of this world to the greater joys, basically. But concerning the resurrection of the dead, have you not known precisely that spoken to you by God, saying, "I am the God of Abraham, and God of Isaac, and God of Jacob"? He is not the God of the dead, but the God of the living. He rejects their pantheistic notions, asserts the personality of God, teaches that those of whom Yahweh is God cannot be dead but alive. God is. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are. These men are dead so far as the world is able to perceive, but they are as certainly alive as God is. And so, see, we can likewise think of marriage in heaven in the same way, is that to the world there is none from their perspective, but from the higher perspective there's another thing, right? See, it doesn't necessarily negate it in that passage, but then again, not everything said that that the Bible says one individual says or whatever, because these Luke and Matthew and Mark and John, they're not claiming to be witnesses. They're claiming to have compiled, to have done an investigation, some sort of history into what people say about Jesus. And see, as God is, it's some sort of eternal thing rather than temporal. He answers their quotations from Moses of the provision for the Levirate marriages by showing them by another quotation from Moses, Exodus 3:6, how the belief in the continued existence of men after death underlay the highest teachings of the great lawgiver. He gives them to understand that their question, which was propounded in the spirit of libertinism, involved a gross error which came of their ignorance of both the meaning of Scripture and the power of God. It does not seem that Jesus charged the Sadducees with being ignorant of the omnipotence of God, but that they did not discern the power of God in Holy Scripture, that to them a writing was a writing and nothing more. In short, that they did not know that the fact of the power of God being in the Scripture was a proof that God is a spirit. The marriage relation is one of the natural and not the spiritual body. Well, but then they're talking about life too, so you can say, well, the body's not getting married after you die, unless somebody's really sick, right? So you can't think of it in the worldly term of marriage. This forced Levirate marriage was most unnatural. And see, the forced marriage period is unnatural. That's one of the things in Islamic State that they put a stop to, is the forced marriage. Also the next of kin marriage. And also the polyandry marriage. Whether any love existed between the widow and her brother-in-law, whether or not she loved another man better, or he had already a wife whom he loved, his brother's widow must be taken to his arms. Now, also the marrying a mother and a daughter or two sisters or that sort of thing, they don't allow. But anything like that else is just up to whatever religious community a person's a part of, right? It's not up to the state to approve or disapprove the marriage. It's up to the religious community of whatever choosing the person takes. There should be no need for any such regulation in the world which men enter at death. There the men do not marry, and women are not married. If sex remain, there is nothing which demands such unions as we have on earth. So then, the case which the Sadducees cited as conclusive really had no bearing whatever on the question under discussion. Well, back in the day, marriage was actually a lot more simple. You just declared that you were married, and some cultures till today, you show up in the port. You sit with the in the early morning. You sit with the woman and on your porch, and people are like, oh yeah, dude got married You didn't tell me you were going to get married, Lord. I didn't know until this morning. Which is problematic in itself. But anyways, the Sadducees did not see far enough to perceive that human beings may exist in two states successively without losing their identity, while we, who are in one of those states, do not see how arrangements of the other can at all correspond with this. A priori, it would be reasonable to suppose that we could not see this connexion, and that any difficulty proposed would amount simply to an acknowledgment of our ignorance, and no proof of any other proposition whatever. That is what Jesus implies. You are in error. Your error is the result of your ignorance, but your ignorance can have no effect upon the facts of God and of eternity. And, of course, eternally, it would be known the consciousness and deeds of your life. So, there's that. So it's instantly known whether people should be married. And the things that you don't foresee, it's like you don't foresee that in a few years the marriage is going to be horrible or something. That's not part of the afterlife of a good person or something. But the reply of Jesus silenced the Sadducees and excited the admiration of the multitude. And even some of the better-minded Pharisees, according to Luke, exclaimed, "Well said!" So delighted were they with the reply. One of them, a lawyer, came forward with a question to Jesus. The term lawyer, namikos, so frequent in the evangelists, must be understood to mean one who devoted himself to the study and exposition of the Mosaic Law. A biblical scholar, a doctor of divinity, rather than one practicing in the courts of civil and criminal law, we are not quite sure as to the spirit which prompted this question. The Pharisees were undoubtedly elated that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees. They might have felt now was the time to show their superiority by proposing a good question, implying they were not concerned in things so gross as those which occupied the Sadducees. Or this lawyer may have personally desired to know what was the opinion of this teacher upon a question which was one of great interest in the schools of the Pharisees. Or the Pharisaic party may have wished to make him repeat the command which asserted the great doctrine of monotheism, from which they argued, as Muhammad has subsequently, that God could have no son, and to reflect it upon the claim which Jesus had made of being the Son of God in an exceptional sense. Well, the Christians claim that, but the Bible doesn't. It kind of gets the way around that, because if someone takes it literally, exorcism, someone's kind of trying to make him more of a lord than a rabbi. No, only God's that sort of good Lord. Oh no, nope. It's I don't speak my own doctrine. I speak the one who sent him, just like Muhammad. The sort of thing that Muhammad said. And the whole of Tanakh is used to refute that idea of there being a God beside God, or before or after. Or with, or whatever words you're going to throw on that. Those passages in Tanakh make that part clear. And no expectation that there's, the Baal, son of El thing is, it's literally going to be true at some point, but it's just not right. In these cases, no. Vicarious atonement is no, that's just wrong. But at some point it's going to be right. It's like, okay. These suppositions are suggested by the question itself, by the answer of Jesus, and by the counter-question which followed. The lawyer asked, "Of what nature is the first commandment of all?" This is strictly the meaning of the question, and not as in the common version of Mark, which is the first, and of Matthew, which is the greatest commandment. The legal spirit had taken such a possession of the Jews that they enumerated, says Braun, 365 prohibitions, according to the days of the year, and 228 commandments. Yeah, that doesn't come out right. It's supposed to be 613 commandments. According to the parts of the body. Right? Isn't it 613 commandments? The Pharisees distinguished between light and heavy, great and small laws. They regarded them quantitatively. Each command in the Decalogue had its adherents. There was no danger in any selection Jesus might make. But the point of peril lay here. If he said, as was most probable from his character and teaching, that the first commandment, "Thou shalt have no other God before me," contained the principle of supreme love to God, his answer would make the basis for a charge of blasphemy. No, it wouldn't. But people say, "Oh, you differ from me in religion, blasphemy." No, that's not what blasphemy is. In the original, it is poia. What kind of a law? What is the spirit and principle of the chief law? We shall see that the two counts against Jesus at last were political aspiration and blasphemy, into both which his adversaries had endeavored to force him, and having failed of the first, they are still trying the second. Jesus answered, the first is, "Hear, Israel," Shema Yisrael. But see, the upright of God, that those who struggle for God, the mujahideen, that varies per thing. You're not, automatically for the rest of your life with no effort or no belief, whatever. But Shema is also the obedience. So you're not just listening to it, but you're, the Lord our God is one Lord. Yeah, Lord as in Yahweh, so Lord's not a proper translation of that. Increasing existence, God is a noun and verb. Establishing, sure, but Lord is not a right translation of it. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your intellect and all your strength. This is the first and greatest commandment. So that refutes Christianity right there. It's the achid, the oneness of God. In the Quran, Qul huwallahu ahad, first and greatest command. The second is like it. This, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is not any other commandment greater than these. On these two commandments depend the law and the prophets. Now, Rabbi Hillel had died, I think, by the time this was written, so there's that question too, but then again, any prophet wouldn't be like, I am totally unique in everything. It's like, no. It would be perceived that he had foiled their efforts to make him compromise himself politically. So now, from any involvement in blasphemy, which would have been caused by surrender of the claims he had already made, especially if accompanied by an assertion of the debt of supreme love to God alone, Jesus saved himself by adding immediately after the first command the second, and saying that it was like the first, and then conjoining them and declaring that on the two was suspended all that the law and the prophets contained. Now, religion is a relationship with God and a relationship to creation. So, but if you love God more than all else, you're doing the rights to creation as enumerated, are with the consciousness or consideration of principles involved, right? It was bringing together what God had joined and man had separated, namely God and man, heaven and earth. It was a declaration that all the morality of the law and the religious faith and fervor of the prophets lay in loving God up to the full measure of human capability and loving one's fellow man up to the full measure of a healthy and natural self-love, which has not run to selfishness. The reply was simple, comprehensive, and sublime. Now, in the Quran, you find more references to love by and for God than the entire Bible. You find more of a focus on the verb aspect than the noun aspect. And we find this in reference to Jesus here, that the Bible says that this love teaching is basically just, for the most part, Judaism. And then the writer, after the Gospels, we have some passages, but